let's start this session. On behalf of the University of Technology Sydney and Ewak Sandek, I'd like to welcome you to our Spotlight Series number 2 session on Citywide Inclusive Sanitation. In the next 90 minutes, we've put up a program that will allow you to get a better understanding of what CWISE is all about. And I will take you shortly through the program. We first give an introduction and provide you with an explanation about CWISE, what it is all about, what does it mean, what are the changes to business as usual. We will then introduce 2 case studies from Africa and Asia, one from a World Bank supported Lusaka project on citywide inclusive sanitation, and one supported by SNV in Kushtia, Bangladesh. In each of these 2 cases, we will be presenting a short teaser so that you can make your choice. We then break out into 2 breakout rooms at 11:30, and you have the choice between Africa and Asia. We've allocated enough time, about 45 minutes, for these breakout rooms, so to allow in-depth discussion around the issues in these 2 case studies. At 12:15, we come together in the plenary, and we will then hear the main key takeaways from the 2 breakout rooms. And we finalize the session with a Mentimeter with 3 questions, which we'd like you to answer online. With that, I'd like to hand over to Abhishek and give us an introduction to CWISE.
Thank you very much, Christoph. So I'm going to share my screen. Hope you can see it. Good. So welcome once again. I'm sure all of us in the sector have heard about the term Citywide Inclusive Sanitation, or CWISE. It's been very popular in the last couple of years. But in the next 10 minutes, I just want to quickly take you through, bring you up to speed on what's the latest thinking around CWISE, and if there's someone who's still a little unfamiliar with this term, try to broaden out the scope and cover what the principles and some of the definitions are. So this, what you see in front of you is very common sight across Sub-Saharan Africa, across South Asia, and many other parts of the world. And I'm not going to preach to the choir and say why urban sanitation is important. We are having a conference on urban sanitation and fecal sludge management. So I'm definitely not going to preach to the choir. But it's just important to think about the fact that urban sanitation is really complex. And in the last 40 years, we've tried to achieve a lot of things, but still the sanitation situation across the world is fairly poor. But that's not to say that we've not made progress, because we have some clear progress in thinking in terms of what is right and what is wrong around urban sanitation. And here are 4 evolved thinking about urban sanitation that has come up. For example, equity in service. This is something that has been again and again spoken about, how people shouldn't be marginalized, how sanitation must be affordable, and the human rights approach, and so on. But also about how solutions should be contextualized to the local situation and the local needs. And this is achievable only if we have inclusive planning with various stakeholders who will be brought to the same table. And if we do some of these things right, then we get both environmental and social justice. So CWISE is basically this, brings various evolved thinking under the same umbrella. And the reason why it's really exciting for me is because for the first time, our sector is kind of coming together and putting a unified foot forward and have a large agreement on what has to be done in terms of achieving urban sanitation SDGs. You can see that it's not just development partners, but also research, academia, NGOs, and even governments in many cases have been embracing the CWISE approach. It's still exciting for all of you because this concept is not set in stone and it is constantly evolving, and there's scope for everyone to contribute and shape the way it's taken forward. So how did this concept even come about? It all started in a small conference table in Atlanta, in 2016, after which they released a call for action in Stockholm, and then $1 billion was committed by the Gates Foundation and the World Bank. And then once we started understanding that this concept is getting a lot of backing, we started to clarify what Citywide means in terms of the principles. And then there was this big academic output last year in terms of various thinking around Citywide. And in 2021, and I'm really excited about the fact that there's so many Citywide pilots happening across the world, and many of which you already know of, and we'll kind of dive into two of which from the Asian case and the African case, which you can learn about in further detail. So I think I've spoken a lot about CY. So what is it, right? In terms of one single sentence, it's basically an approach where all members have equitable, adequate, affordable, improved. These are all just terms from the human rights approach and the SDGs. And we achieve this through both sewered and non-sewered sanitation, while preventing any sort of contamination into the environment throughout the sanitation value chain. So you might see that this is a very wordy definition, but that's what has to be done if we have to pack so much into one sentence. But if you want to split this and really understand what CWISE is, I think this slide gives you the most important information. CWISE is basically 6 important things. First is equity, to make sure that everybody has the same kind of access and there's no one who's marginalized, no one's left behind. Similarly, we take care of both public health, but also environmental health. And we do this through a mix of technologies, centralized, decentralized, and all that. And we also have to think about long-term comprehensive planning, which is inclusive. And once things are implemented, we need to have clear accountability, this political will, and so on, capacities and so on. And this also allows us to have the private sector participate. So these are the 6 most important things on what CWISE means, and kind of covers the entire spectrum. We, of course, don't have time to go into details into all of these principles, but let's just take a quick look at equity, technology, mix of technologies, and about planning. So in terms of equity, this is a really complex term according to me. It's not super easy to understand because it could mean different things to different people. But here's one interpretation, a very simple way of understanding what equity is in the context of the wash sector. So imagine there's 2 households, one fairly poor and one fairly rich. And if you're the government or the service provider, and equality to you would be bringing equal lengths of pipes or bringing equal lengths to the to sanitation services. But this, of course, means there's still unequal access from the perspective of the users. So equal services does not mean equal access to service itself. But equity, on the other hand, means you provide the service that the household needs and not just a uniform set of service for everyone. And this comes from the perspective of the user, which means that all the users have the exact kind of service from their perspective. And of course, justice means that we're not only thinking about users, but we're also thinking about social justice, environmental justice. And that could be achieved in a way that we contextualize solutions. And for example, we tap into a different water source, or we try to use a different kind of sanitation system and not just trying to use the same cookie cutter approach for all different contexts. So I think this picture kind of gives you a sense of what equity is and justice is. And one of the ways we try to achieve equity and justice in the wash sector is through subsidies. And we find that subsidies are often poorly targeted. And although we spend about $320 billion every year on wash subsidies, they are quite non-transparent and they're not very effective. And one of the reasons is because 56% of all subsidies reach the richest part of the country, whereas only 6% is left for the poorest quintile of the country's population. And of course, subsidies are expensive, they're poorly targeted, and they kind of make people think that wash is subsidized, but often the poorer households end up subsidizing the rich because they pay more for FSM services than the rich pay for sewer-based services, and still receive substandard service if the government itself is not providing adequate FSM services and it's relied on stopgap measures by private sector. So unless there's clear regulations and making sure the service type and the access is uniform and of good quality, then you often find poor subsidizing the rich. Now let's move on to mix of technologies. What we mean by this is we shouldn't follow a cookie cutter approach. Rather, we should look at context-specific solutions, not just city to city, but even within the same city. What we mean by that if you take a look at this picture, the central business districts of any city are often a little bit better planned and have good amount of population density and often have some kind of existing sewerage system. So in these kinds of places, sewers do make sense. Whereas there are the green pockets that you see show it could be a gated community, it could be a mall, it could be a slightly a smaller peri-urban community, which is in the distance from the city center. So these kinds of places could be served with decentralized systems. And finally, different other parts. Sorry. Yeah. And different other parts of the city, for example, the slums, the peri-urban regions, etc., could be served with fecal sludge management. And this is, of course, just an example. You can also have container-based solutions and so on. This is merely an example. And now, in terms of planning, you kind of found that citywide inclusive sanitation means multiple complex things, and for which you need comprehensive planning. So here's the 4S pillars of comprehensive planning, which is doing detailed situation analysis, stakeholder inclusive planning, synergy with not just the sanitation sector, but also you're thinking about water sector, solid waste sector, and so on. And finally, thinking long-term and taking incremental steps. So here's the latest thinking that we've been working on trying to think about comprehensive planning in terms of citywide inclusive sanitation. And you can see that there's these the different parts of the Manila principles are kind of seen as operational targets, and the other evolved thinking is the functional linkages. But this is quite abstract. You need, in order for you to plan well, you need tools which are comprehensive. And it's nice to see that the sector has been pushing a lot of tools over the last few years. For example, the CY SAP just came out, the FSM toolbox, SFDs, costing planning tool by the World Bank, and so on. So I hope that kind of gave you a sense of what CWISE is and what's some of the latest thinking in this direction is. So we have maybe a couple of minutes for questions. So if you have questions, maybe now's the time to shoot. Yes, you can raise your hand. I think that's one way. Or you can also unmute yourself and speak. I think. Any clarifying questions at this stage? Yeah, if you can also post on the chat box. Okay.
Everything seems to be clear. So why don't we move on? Juliet, to you. Oh, sorry, there's one. Does this also address how the service is provided, i.e. inclusion in government departments?
So one of the key things about making sure CWISE is embraced is having buy-in from the government stakeholders, but also having very clear regulations and monitoring systems. That's kind of what Principle 5 talks about. And you do this by having a clear ring-fenced budget. You have a clear, for example, one of the things I often hear when I go to conferences is how Lusaka's utility was renamed to be water and sanitation utility and not just sewer utility. So Of course, you need the government's buy-in and the support, and certainly ring-fenced funding, but also ring-fenced human capacities to provide a sanitation solution. So yes, I certainly think the government has a pretty significant role to play. Debisha has raised her hand.
Hi,
Hi,
hello,
Debisha.
hello, Abhishek, hello, Christoph. Hello. So the thing is, I just wanted to ask that when you said that uh, the poor subsidizing the rich, and you are implying that for the FS availing the desalination services or any of the FS services, the poor spend more than what the rich would spend for sewer lines. So I just wanted to understand which are the components you are looking at, because many times we also hear the opposite, that FSM is much more cost effective in many of the situations. So just wanted to understand what are the components you are considering.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of capital expenditure and long-term expense, you have FSM. We did a recent study last year which compared small-scale sanitation, FSM, and centralized sewer-based sanitation. And we clearly saw that FSM was, in every single case, much cheaper in terms of overall costs incurred. But the real question comes in, who is bearing what costs? So in India, for example, in many of the studies that we've seen, the FSM cost is often borne by the user, whereas the sewer costs in many places are borne by the city, and the city often subsidizes the sewer cost. So this way, if you see who bears the cost for the user, they end up paying a lot more for FSM services than a comparable user would for sewer-based services.
Got it. So it's not about the absolute cost; it's more about on whom the burden of the cost falls.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
That's with the equity principle. Okay, thanks a lot. We have to move on. I'll hand over the microphone to Juliet now.
Great, thanks, Christoph. So Juliet Willits from University of Technology, Sydney, and great to see such a large range of participants. For me, it's evening, but good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So I'd like to take us to the next section, which is a focus on actual case studies. So what Abhishek presented, as he said, is at a conceptual level, but to help us think about what this means in practice, we're going to hear from a case study, one from Africa and one from Asia. And these are just a teaser initial presentation, because after that you'll be choosing to go into a breakout room and you'll be able to join one or either of the case studies to have a much more in-depth conversation. So the first case study that we're going to look at is focused on Lusaka, and Ruth Kennedy Walker, who is a World Bank water and sanitation specialist in charge of the Lusaka sanitation program. She's going to share some insights about the experience in Lusaka, and particularly relating that to the Citywide principle that Abhishek mentioned around mix of technologies. So over to you, Ruth.
Okay, thanks, Julia. So I just want to firstly note Mwanza, my other colleague from the Lusaka Sanitation Project, is also online, but I'm going to speak for the teaser, and then in the breakout room we can hear plenty more from her. She's a wonderful colleague and just one of the many reasons why you should join our breakout room. Okay, so good morning, afternoon and evening, everyone. As I say, Mwanza and I are here today to present the case study and specifically putting a spotlight on the two key citywide inclusive sanitation approach principles that have been put into practice in the capital of Zambia, Lusaka, through the wider Lusaka sanitation program, but in particular the World Bank Finance project. So to give a little bit of background, I know I only have a few minutes, but in 2011, the government of Zambia developed and approved the Lusaka Sanitation Investment Master Plan, which called for universal coverage of Lusaka province by 2035 through a combination of sewered and on-site sanitation systems. And a number of large financiers pulled in together and launched the $300 million Lusaka sanitation program in 2015. And the bank specifically partnered with the government and the Lusaka Water and Sanitation Company and contributed 65 million to the program. So really, I think the government of Zambia really was ahead of the curve. I don't think citywide inclusive sanitation had even been developed in 2011, and they really saw that they needed both types of both sewered and on-site systems to be able to provide inclusive sanitation for the whole city. So the first citywide inclusive sanitation principle, which is, as we heard, it's looking at appropriate technology solution, both on-site and sewered, in either centralized or decentralized systems, with the consideration of resource recovery and reuse. And so in our breakout session, we will talk more about how this has been put into practice in Lusaka. So with a mix of on-site sanitation, the focus on fecal sludge management, and the sewer interventions that have been put in scale at the city. And we'll talk about the construction of on-site sanitation, how things like human-centered design has been included, how really looking at the ground conditions. We have a lot of different areas facing different ground conditions in Lusaka, so how we haven't just done one set. The program hasn't done one size fits all. How we've done innovative financing for on-site sanitation. Then also, obviously, fecal sludge management. There's been an introduction of performance-based contracts and performance scorecards to ensure the safety of emptiers and the service guarantee to the regulator. So that's very interesting to learn about. Also, how the FSM wasn't part of the utilities mandate before this program. So how they've really embraced that, and the staffing and the development of a standalone FSM unit. And then also not forgetting the on-site sanitation, the sewage side of things. So how that's been enhanced through the project, how the design and construction of the tertiary mains has been done to make it easier and cheaper for households to connect, because we know connectivity is often an issue with sewage systems, how sewage management has been enhanced, and then overall how Lusaka Water and Sanitation companies project implementation capacity has been increased to be able to better operate and maintain the new facilities, respond better to customer demand, and delivering the sanitation services more effectively and efficiently. And now how we're coming to the end of the World Bank project, we're moving from strengthening this within the project implementation, but more centrally, looking at more centrally within the utility. And then just very quickly, we're also going to talk about the second principle, which is the cities demonstrate political will, technical, managerial leadership, and identify new and creative long-term funding options. So we'll talk about this, talked a little bit about it then, that they really were ahead of the curve about citywide inclusive sanitation, how the utility even changed its name. For example, it was originally Sewerage Company, now it's Sanitation Company. They've really taken this line of business on. They're looking at the sustainability of this beyond the length of the program, and looking at ways to finance this. And we will talk about this, how they really took the theory and put it in reality in the city. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I know I only had a few minutes. Thank you.
Great, fantastic, Ruth. And yeah, as Ruth mentioned, she'll be joined by Mwanza Mafuka. So you'll be able to hear in depth about that entire breadth of experience. It's, I'd say it's, world leading. If we think about implementation of a mix of technologies and attending to all those different angles, including the financing, the different on the ground conditions. So from here, we'll now move to hear from our second case study. So we're going to hear from Shahidul Islam, who is a governance advisor for WASH at SNB Development Organisation, and he's going to be sharing with you some highlights from the case study in Kushtia in Bangladesh. And when they go into the breakout room, he'll also be joined by engineer Wahidur Rahman, who's from the city, from Kushtia. So I'll hand over now to Shahidul. And
okay. Good afternoon. Can you see my screen?
Yep, all good, Shahidul.
Okay.
You can press, if you press present, that will be even better.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
perfect. Thank you.
Okay, I and Mr. Wahidur will share the enforcement mechanism that Kushtia municipality in Bangladesh introduced in order to achieve the safely managed sanitation in their town. So I will share this brief here, and later in breakout session, Wahidur will discuss in details. So in Bangladesh, perhaps you're aware of that there are sufficient number of acts, policies, regulations, and strategies around this sanitation. And these studies and acts, though it is mentioned by particular objectives, but it has a sanitation component, and it considers the environment, health, and also the equity. For example, the proper studies recently approved, the revised one. So all these are very good instrument at the national level from the policy and regulatory perspective. But local government ministry, so local government division, particularly responsible for sanitation across the country. So considering all these elements included in this policy and legal frameworks, developed this framework, we call it institutional regulatory framework for fecal sludge management, and also developed a national action plan to implement. So particularly this is a very effective and comprehensive guideline for the municipalities so that they can implement this fecal sludge management, and particularly this septic sanitation, so accelerate it. Okay, so here in this IRF particularly, it describes the roles and responsibility of the stakeholders, so clearly defined, because earlier it was not so defined, but defined, and also it describes the ways and means of implementing the FSM and CYs, supplementary sanitation. However, at the local level, we found a lot of issues that hinders the achievement acceleration of the achieving supplementary sanitation by the targeted time frame. And among them, so we can see that, okay, the lack of awareness among the citizens. So people does not know what the legal compliances are that, how the environmental compliances, health compliance, equity issues are not aware of this. Also, the roles are not, though it is defined in the regulatory framework, but it is not well communicated among the actors that are engaged, are responsible for the sanitation in the cities. And the guidelines and tools, those are insufficient yet, and also not context specific. And because those are not context specific, so the equity are not, as the equitable service are not provided. For example, the proper strategy. It is common for urban and rural both, but so in order to give the proper services for the slum, for example, in the cities. So this need to be specific guidelines and tools. So this is still absent. And city does not know how that can be applied. And also, obviously, the enforcement is lack because of there's no penalty system and incentive mechanism. So because of that, because of all these things, so achievement or acceleration of supplementary sanitation is progressing very slow, because of though there are sufficient policies, regulations, and legal provisions. So in order to so Kustia municipality just last year, they have come up in order to address all these issues that hinders and also to implement the IRF and all these legal things. They come up with the sanitation bylaws and also occupational health and safety guidelines. These are the two vital documents. Those are legally legal documents, and Kustia municipality has legally that they can. There's provision in the Local Government Act that the municipality can introduce the develop the bylaws. So they introduced the bylaws last year through for a long-term in-depth consultation at the local level. In this breakout session, so Wahidur will discuss all these elements of the bylaws and the development process, and how it is being implemented, and how these are two important tools are addressing all these issues that I mentioned. This is very briefly. I hope that you will enjoy the discussions in the breakout session on these issues, bylaws and OECS guidelines. So there are two very effective enforcement tools that they are applying. Thank you from my side.
Fantastic, thank you, Shahidul. And I guess you can now see that you're presented with a very difficult choice to know which of these breakout rooms you might want to go to. Both show quite different case studies. This last case study, as you heard from Shahidul, is focused more on principle around accountability, which is so important if we want to have clear roles and responsibilities and clear allocation of responsibilities. And the experience of Kustia Again, like Lusaka, is one of the world leading ones, and there is much that you will learn if you attend that breakout room. So from here, you will be able to select when we open the rooms, which you will go to. The first room will be a focus on Lusaka, the second on Kustia. And we will be going into those breakout rooms for about 35 to 45 minutes. So you'll have time to ask questions and also to hear from our presenters explain in a little bit more depth their particular case study. And so I think if we can now launch the breakout rooms, and please just select the one that you would like to attend, and we'll see you back here in about 40 minutes.
Yeah, those breakout rooms are shut,
Perfect.
and everyone seems to be back.
Okay, very good. So, Juliet, you want to start with Kustia feedback?
So sure. So perhaps I might mention a couple of points, and then Debisha was a participant in our session and also offered to cover some key highlights. So from my perspective, so as we said in the previous plenary session, the focus was around regulations and accountability in terms of the CWISE principles. And in the breakout room, we heard a lot more about how the municipality has been able to take on a role, not just in having the guidelines, but actually enforcing them and having realistic ways to do that. And that means, you know, not being able to monitor everything themselves, but making sure that, for instance, an engineer who's involved in the house construction, that they're the one that's responsible for ensuring, say, a septic tank is designed properly. So passing down layers of accountability so that you don't get a bottleneck at the layer of municipality. Another key point I wanted to raise that relates to the principles was that we talked about a sanitation tax, which is part of a property tax in Kustia. I think it's a critical part of CWISE. We need to have viable financial systems and models, not just business models, but also how we can ensure a public service that is equitable. And in Kustia, the sanitation tax has been able to be ring-fenced to just be used for sanitation. It's being used to subsidise to reach the poor, and it's also being used to expand treatment facilities as demand increases. So those were some of the links back to the CWISE principles. But Debisha, do you want to add a few highlights from your perspective as a participant in that breakout room?
Yes, so thank you, Juliet. And definitely, like in addition to what you said, what really struck me was that they connected like, you know, some things which are like, you know, maybe under a little bit different departments, like they connected housing and like, you know, the sanitation infrastructure. Like when they're converting, they said that, okay, we only allow septic tanks in the country, but then actually the reality is most of the like poorer households which are in the which we call the kacha households, which are not concretized. The non-concretized households many a times have pits. Now they will be converting those pits to septic tanks only when they are actually reconstructing them and building concrete houses. And they're connecting these two, that when people are applying for housing permissions, they are also ensuring that the correct sizes of containments and correct type of containments are implemented. So that was one interesting point for me. Another one was that similarly they connected licensing and training, that okay, when people are so in order to ensure that everybody who is trained is also delivering and they are licensed, so they connected all of this, that okay, if you're getting licensed, then you must get trained and only then you can deliver your services. So I was very fascinated that they have, you know, like, you know, interconnected, like, you know, that okay, if you have to, we want to do your business, then you have to do this. If you want housing, that housing is something that is people's on top of their heads, that they always want a concrete house, but then not so much of the toilet maybe. So they connected, okay, you need to construct a proper toilet with a proper septic tank. So they have connected, these interlinkages was something I really liked. And apart from that, they have talked about that how they have thought ahead, that like as they are coming up with the guidelines for formalization of the private sector vehicles, they are also thinking about that how they will be incorporating as a part of the guidelines compliance the whole monitoring mechanism, that people are using the safety gears and conducting the whole event, the desludging business in a very safe manner. And they have connected again over that they are planning to connect the down the line when they do the licensing, they will be also ensuring the compliance and the licensing, they go hand in hand. So these were some things that I really liked. And yeah, I think lastly he very well summarized the whole focus on that how reuse has become very important, and they are actually now planning to expand the plant capacity, because the compost that is coming out of the plant, that is being used very and taken up very enthusiastically by the farmers around. So yes, those are something that were my key takeaways. Thank you, Julia.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, Dabisha. Yeah, over to you, Christoph.
Yeah, so in the Lusaka discussion, we had quite a lively discussion on issues of equity. So how do we ensure that the poorest living in Lusaka also have access to equitable services? Quite a number of interesting solutions were shown to that. They did a very rigorous willingness to pay and ability to pay analysis of the different participants, and also try to come up with a fee structure that allows also the poorest. They call this not a subsidy, but a discount that households were able to tap to, for example, build an improved septic tank on their plots. The other options, the other discussion points that we were looking at is how did the mix of technologies take place? So improving sewer services, but also providing for top-notch FSM services through private sector operators that were able to formalize during the process and undercut also then the informal sector providers. Last question was asked was, would this project have been radically different if it would not have been a Citywide project? And the clear answer was the World Bank would not have funded the project if it would not have been a Citywide oriented project. Peter, can I ask you to add your points?
Okay, thanks, Chris. Yeah, no, this was very interesting. I was involved in this project a few years ago, but I've moved on since then. And I was very pleased to see that it is now, after a lot of going backwards and forwards, solidifying. It was pretty difficult initially, years-long discussion with Lusaka Water Sanitation Corporation Management. But finally, clearly, the on-site sanitation part is now fully established, and I think that's a great achievement. And what I noticed in the way the different elements were going on, the bylaws, the regulation, the institutional changes in LWSC, and so on, this is one of the big challenges, I think, in any sanitation project, and because you need all the bits to work together, and you need one before the other, but you don't have any of them to start with. And I think it's shown that by working hard and really focusing, that possibly over 5 or 6 years, you can sort of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and get this going. And I think that's a very encouraging message. It may be a bit messy, but certainly it can bring results. I also like this idea of the use of the cheapest emptying cost as a base fee, and then topping up according to justified cost structures of different providers. I think it's a good way of sorting out subsidies, and something that other people might take a good look at.
Okay.
And yeah.
Thanks, Peter. That's great. We have 5 more minutes to go, and we would now like to open the Mentimeter site. We have 3 questions for you to answer at the end of this session. and kind of give us the feedback that you took away from this session with us. And here comes the first question, Juliet.
So, having heard the principles, having heard at least one of the case studies in depth, we want to understand, what does CWISE mean to you? And specifically to weigh up each of the different 6 dimensions that Abhishek talked about in the opening. So if you go to www.menti.com, and then you need to type in the code at the top, 64175073, and that should take you to the question, and it's just a slider scale. It should be fairly quick and easy to have a go. How would you weight the importance of these different principles? Are they all super important, or do you think certain of them are much more important than others?
And the first question is color coded. So you have to choose the right color.
Okay, so at the moment, equity is winning out as the most important principle. Comprehensive planning coming not far behind, and including stakeholders in that planning. So in general, they're all very important. So not many low votes. I think only mix of business or service models has maybe a handful of very low votes. And equity still in the lead. It's like being a sports commentator or something, observing Mentimeter. So we've got 24 participants, so we'll just wait a little bit longer until we've got at least half
30,
of this group.
30, I would
voted.
say 30, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, mine says 27, maybe it's going up slower.
Now it's 30? Nope.
Yep, okay, we've hit 30. So we have equity on top, closely followed by accountability, which was the focus of what we spoke about for Kushtia, and comprehensive planning. Okay, over to you, Christoph, and maybe we'll move on to the next question.
Okay, next question. The next question is, how much capacity building exposure is required for each of the CWISE principles in your understanding? So where do we need most training capacity building issues? Okay, so we have 32 responses. We can see comprehensive planning, stakeholder inclusion, seen as where most capacity building is needed, followed by pretty much the same marking for equity, environmental health, accountability, mix of business models. Great. And the last question, Julia.
So we would like to hope that you've learned something from this session and that you've got some ideas about what you might do with that learning. And we'd love to hear from you. Do you plan to use this approach in your work? And it's great to see that we have mostly yeses. And one of the things I wanted to say as we finish up, Christoph and all, is that we really encourage you to explore some of the things that have been written about Citywide inclusive sanitation. There's an emerging both academic literature, including an issue of Frontiers of Environmental Science, on where you can, if you Google Citywide inclusive sanitation, you'll find a couple of papers which were written on it. And there's also an emerging literature, I guess, on experiences like Lusaka and Kushtia, that are useful to seek out.
And the last question, what was your key learning from this session? You can type in anything. It can be a short sentence, it can be some bullet points, whatever you'd like. Okay, we're not going to read all of these. I think you can read them yourself. Okay, we've reached almost 30 responses. Abhishek, I think we can close the Mentimeter. Thanks for sharing your thoughts, and thank you for joining our session on Citywide. We hope that we were able to unpack the enigma of Citywide for you with two very concrete case studies from Asia and Africa, and we look forward to sharing future development of Citywide in the future. Juliet?
Yep, thanks also from me, and particularly thanks to our presenters from Lusaka and Kustia for your generosity and answering, you know, a multitude of questions about your cases and sharing those experiences with everyone. Thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of FSM 6.
Thank you. Bye-bye.